everybody, and welcome to the making of Spring Snow White. The very first thing I did was gather all of my supplies for this project. I have this sheer shower curtain that I paid for $3.98 from Goodwill, some yellow Rit dye more to dye the fabric yellow for the skirt, some Dollar Tree flowers and birds, some fat quarters from Walmart, and then I also have some ribbons and beads that I got from my local reuse center and my stash. Now that I had all my supplies, it was time to start boiling the water so that I could dye the skirt fabric yellow. Oh. Oh, that is a nasty color. That is putrid. The stick's gone. Okay. Now, dyes almost always look different when you pour them into water because they're so concentrated, but I never used a synthetic dye before, and this looked so brown and gross, it didn't look yellow at all. So before dunking my fabric in, I decided to try dyeing some flowers. I wasn't really sure if this would work considering that they're so plasticky and synthetic, but I wanted to try and see if they would hold a little bit of dye. And then I went for the plunge, and I plunged my fabric into the dye. Just kidding, I actually tested a little corner, and then I tested a little bit of a bigger corner, and then I plunged all the fabric into the dye. I hadn't actually gotten a big enough container or a big enough dye bath, so I just kind of kept poking the fabric in and hoping that I would wet it enough so that the color would evenly color the fabric. Now I tell you, this project was destined to fail from the start. I only dipped the flowers into the dye solution a few times, up and down, up and down. I didn't hold them in there very long, and somehow they came out this beautiful light yellow color. And for the fabric, I only let it sit in the hot water for like 10 minutes, probably closer to 7 or 8 minutes, and it came out this beautiful bright yellow color, much darker than I was hoping for. I barely stirred the fabric. It wasn't even completely covered with water and dye solution, and somehow it came out perfectly even. There are no splotches where it's darker or lighter, and it just came out absolutely perfect. If you read the instructions, it actually says to take your water and dye solution, put it in a stainless steel pot, put it on the stove top, and boil it with your fabric constantly being stirred for 30 to 40 minutes so that the fibers can open up and take in the dye. I didn't do any of that. Here you can see the fabric. It turned out much darker than I was hoping for, but considering that I didn't actually boil the water, I didn't know if it would open up and take any of the dye at all, so this was a huge win. Plus, this is a sheer material, so if I put a lighter or a white fabric underneath as an underskirt layer, it's not going to look as dark in color. I have always been so fortunate when dyeing things for projects. I almost never follow the instructions, and everything has always come out perfectly even. Next step was to dismantle all of the flowers, except it wasn't quite that easy. It looked a lot more like this, except this is also easy because it sped up. It was much slower. And then it was time to unwrap all of my fat quarters and iron them out. Normally I don't use fat quarters for projects. I would use yardage, but I was at Walmart. They didn't have anyone near the cutting table, so I just grabbed some pre-cut fat quarters. It was easier. I don't own a mannequin for draping, so I use this pattern for the sleeves, this pattern for the bodice, and this pattern for the collar, and then I kind of just tweaked everything to make it work for me. I actually cut the collar out of the skirt material before I dyed it. For the bodice, I just laid 2 of the blue fat quarters, one on top of the other, and I pinned all of my pieces on and cut them out very carefully. I only had 1 pink fat quarter, and the pattern piece was too big, so I just kind of shaved a little bit off of the top and the bottom and the sides. Hi! So I am ever so slightly worried about the sleeves. I didn't have quite enough fabric to actually cut it out. I'm missing this much fabric here on this side, this much fabric here on this side, and then a little along the top here and a little bit along the bottom there, but I think it's all gonna work out. We're gonna make it work. I also cut out some interfacing to stiffen the pink part, and then I also cut out some lining sleeves as well. So I have all of my pieces cut out. The only thing I need to cut out are going to be the blue strips that go over the pink sleeves to give it that classic Snow White look. And then a stiffening layer or lining layer of some sort for the waistband for the skirt, just because the sheer material is a little bit thin. So just a little bit of a recap on what that's going to look like. I have my sheer lining layer for the skirt, a sheer waistband, which I'm going to cut out a thicker waistband for to go underneath. I have both of my pink sleeves interfaced, and I have linings for both of those. I have all of my bodice pieces and linings for those. And then I have my collar with the collar band, which is made out of 2 of these plain sheer materials and then 2 of these lacy kind of embellished sheer materials that match the skirt. For the overlayer skirt made out of that yellow dyed curtain, I just made a regular gathered skirt made out of rectangles, and then I put in a basic waistband. It wasn't anything too special. The great part about using a thrifted curtain is that it was already hemmed on the bottom, so I didn't even need to hem the skirt. This skirt turned out so cute and airy and light. I wish I had had more fabric to gather up into the waistband, but I was working with what I've got. I also needed to add a hook and eye into the skirt, but before I did that, I wanted to change into something a little more comfy cozy, and then I got working on hand sewing that closure in. Now that the base of the skirt was done, it was time to add flowers. Flowers, 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 flowers. Sorry. I ended up taking those dyed yellow flowers and hand sewing 36 of them onto the skirt. I placed them in accordance with the design that was already on this curtain fabric, and I kind of just placed them based on that. Then I placed one of these sparkly little gems into the center of every flower and onto other parts of the skirt based on the design that was already on the curtain, for a total of 72 hand-placed gems on this skirt. It is so sparkly in the correct lighting. I love it so much. I actually don't have that many blue threads compared to some of the other colors that I own, so I don't have an exact match for this top, but I went through all of them and this seems like the closest match I have. All of the other ones are a little bit more like aqua colored and I feel like they're just wrong. So I'm gonna go with this one. It looks a little closer in person. Actually, no, it doesn't. Well, it looks very dark on camera. I don't know, but that's what we're going with. Now that the skirt is completely done, I'm going to move on to the bodice. I have the sleeves, which are going to take quite a bit of work because of the flowers and the detailing with the beads and the gems. And then I also have the bodice itself. So what I'm going to do first is just go ahead and take my bodice and sew the lining together. That way, if I need to make any extra adjustments, I can do that. I sewed up my lining with straight stitches and everything was good to go. So I started on the main bodice, making the piping by throwing some thick yarn into this bit of yellow fabric. I wasn't super excited with how it was looking, but I decided to just move on. Put the right side of my outer bodice and I put the outside of my lining together, and then I just sewed along the top, the neckline, and then I top stitch, no, understitch. And although it was a little late in the stage of the game, I did add some boning into the bodice. I didn't quite have enough flowers for the sleeves, so I just spaced them out and tried my best. I ended up using 42 flowers on each sleeve and hot gluing these into place. I then glued 5 beads into the center of each flower, turning into a total of 210 beads on each sleeve. I also added 40 gems onto each sleeve to fill in the gaps where I didn't have enough flowers. So in total, I had 40 gems on each sleeve for a total of 80. I had 82 flowers on each sleeve for a total of 84, and I had 210 beads on each sleeve for a total of 420, which is 584 embellishments total. For the blue stripy bits on the sleeves, I took these rectangles, sewed them right sides together, and then flipped them out into tubes. I did this by using the trusty old chopstick method. You just take your fabric, kind of do this and that, and boom, you have a tube. That wasn't explained very well, so hopefully you are a visual learner like moi. I was tempted to keep the sleeves completely pink and puffy, and then I tried just putting the blue stripes on, but it felt like they were missing something, so I started adding ribbons. I tried this design, but in the end, it didn't seem quite right, and this is what I landed on. It kind of makes the sleeves look lighter, like the original Snow White, because her bodice is darker than the sleeves. I just cut out a bunch of lengths of ribbon, and then I started sewing them down onto the machine. I use this method, which I believe is called chain stitching. I would Google it, but I'm afraid that I would lose this editing draft, and I don't want to do that. And basically, you just kind of keep sewing one after the other, so they're all connected. You waste less thread, and then you're able to snip everything apart in the end. Now, I would be lying if I had said that I hadn't been trying this on at every single step of the process, but this is the point where it was just all coming together, and I was so excited because the sparkle. So I realized it's a little late in the game to add boning into the bodice, but I am going to add boning into the bodice anyway. And since we're talking about boning, because I decided we're talking about boning and I decided to put this edited clip right here in the video so we could talk about it, this is what I usually use for my boning. It's a 100 pack of zip ties from Amazon. This particular brand is a little bit flimsy. It's not my favorite, but the great thing is you can sew through it if you need to. Just be careful. It currently costs right under $20, and I did some math here. 100 zip ties times 15 inches equals a grand total of 41 yards, which is great. That's a pretty good value to get 41 yards for less than $20, except that a lot of the time when you're using the boning, aka the zip tie, you end up cutting off a bunch that you don't end up using. They're usually like 3 to 6 inches long, but they're not really long enough to do anything with. At least I haven't figured out what to do with them yet, so I'm just hoarding them all. So in the end, you're not really getting 41 yards for $20. Now, I have never used any actual boning that is marketed towards the purpose of sewing, whether that be steel boning or spiral boning, or even like plastic boning with the casing or sew through plastic boning. Never used any of it because I was always under the impression that zip ties were the way to go. Well, I also went on Amazon and I figured out that for $10, you can get 50 yards of actual sew-through boning that is meant for sewing. So instead of spending $20 on 41 yards of boning that I can't even use all of the inches of, I can spend $10 and get 50 yards of boning, which is already a better value, and I can get this whole wheel. Now, I have not measured it. I am just assuming that it is actually 50 yards, and hopefully that is the truth. But I'm going to try it out today on this bodice because I don't really want to make boning channels today. And this is sew-through boning. So I'll let you know how it goes. Yeah, both of these are great options. They're both under $20, except this is half the price. It has 9 extra yards, and it has actual more usable inches than the zip ties do. So just depending on what you need, there's 2 great options. Also, I'm going to test this out, and maybe I'm going to regret it and it'll be the worst $10 I ever spent, and I'll go back to my trusty zip ties. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. I inserted the boning and everything worked out okay. I sewed up the sleeves and I sewed up the bottom of the bodice. I sewed up the collar per the instructions, or at least mostly per the instructions, and then I wanted to add on some decorations to the edge of the collar, so I had 2 different vintage laces to pick from. I ended up using the smaller one for the collar and then that bigger one for the bodice. The collar was looking cute, and to this day still has no official way of attaching to the bodice, but I ended up adding 38 gems to add a little bit of sparkle. I also dug this yellow and white checkered bed sheet out of my stash, and I made a little underskirt. This was just $2.99 from Goodwill. I also glued 56 flower gems onto the bodice, which looks really cute, and now it's time for the grand reveal. I would like you to guess how many gems are on this costume in total. Do you think it is less than 247, or do you think it is more than 245? Let me know.